My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. And today I want to answer the question, should complex post-traumatic stress disorder awareness and healing include forgiving our parents? Now, I know this is debated a lot with therapists. Some therapists believe that you should always forgive. On the other hand, some therapists believe it doesn't matter if you forgive or not. And then there's other therapists out there who believe that you can't really forgive anybody unless somebody admits to wrongdoing and they say that they're sorry. I think all of these points are valid. But I also think that the subject changes a little bit when we're dealing with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's how we're going to delve a little bit deeper into this, and this is why I'm going to do this show today, because I do think the situation surrounding CPTSD is a little bit different than most. Now, as a marriage and family therapist, I see this on a constant basis. What I see, at least from my point of view, is a cycle of unmet needs throughout the generations. Therefore, if I am doing therapy on a 25-year-old person, and it becomes obvious that they have reason to have complex post-traumatic stress disorder or response. As the learning process begins, it also becomes very obvious that their parents have every reason to also have complex post-traumatic stress. And their parents' parents, in other words, my client's grandparents, also had every reason to have complex post-traumatic stress. So therefore, the more aware we get, again, it goes back to the original question, if you do have true awareness and you do have true healing, might it be necessary to forgive everybody down the line? Because how do you forgive yourself? Also, because that is interesting. Because again, let's go back to, let's say the 25-year-olds, it doesn't matter, somewhere in that age group that I do therapy with sometimes. And they have children. Their young children are also in very fertile ground for also having CPTSD. Much of the therapy I do is online. It's on the phone, and I can see them, I can hear them in their household. And I know these parents, they're doing the best they can. They're receiving treatment. However, I also know that they're extremely anxious people. They're trying extremely hard to meet all their bills, and many of the times they're not. They're out of the house much of the time trying to make money. And so therefore, they're not around their kids. They get very frustrated easily. I've seen this and I've heard it many times where they're yelling at their kids at the top of their lungs. They're cursing their kids out. And I know it's a little bit different because I'm the old guy, that I actually think that words do matter. I know a lot of people right now, they don't care. Every other word out of their mouth is some type of profanity, and we're all pretty used to it. But I'm still of the belief that cursing at your kids is probably not conducive to raising a child that's going to be happy and healthy in your home. And so I see this all the time. So literally, it's possible to have a client who is beginning to learn about why they have CPTSD, and they learn just enough to start hating and blaming their own parents instead of moving towards forgiveness. And they're doing this while they're causing the same type of stresses that their parents cause on them. They are literally in the same moment causing those stresses on their children. And one day, they're going to be hoping that their kids actually probably forgive them. So again, I'm not telling anybody to forgive. That's up to you. But I'm just going to conceptualize what I see. We're going to use some evidence, obviously, and we're going to use my own experiences as we go through this. CPTSD is a very, very difficult subject. Why? Let's start right from the top. Number one, it's not in the DSM. So right off the bat, it's obviously very important, but the so-called scholars in this field haven't recognized it the way it should be. That's number one. Number two, it's only been recognized in mainstream psychology within about the last 10 years or so, give or take. Now, I know somebody could argue that, and so we can argue it a little bit like this. For example, here's a great book by Dr. Judith Merman, Trauma and Recovery, generally considered to be the first book that mentions complex post-traumatic stress. It came out in 1992. It's a great book. Maybe for clinicians, I mean, I think everybody can get some worth out of it, some value. Unfortunately, it didn't catch on as a complex post-traumatic stress disorder like wave where everybody realized what they were dealing with. I think a lot of that is because no social media back then, really. And now there's a lot of YouTube channels. Therefore, I believe the Bible for CPTSD is this book right here, From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. You can tell I've been through this book about 1,000 times. It's all chewed up. But this is a great book. However, if you want to call this the Bible for complex post-traumatic stress, I have no problem with that, except the fact that it came out in the year 2013. So again, we're only looking about 10 years, a little bit less than this has been in mainstream psychology. Let's continue. Here's another great book, Healing Developmental Trauma. Again, awesome book. People should probably buy it if this is your situation. However, this book came out within, I don't know the copyright, but I think it got published around maybe 5-6 years ago. Again, very new. And here's another great book, The Complex PTSD Workbook. Again, written by Dr. Ariel Schwartz, who's my Facebook friend. Not that that means anything. But again, this book came out less than 10 years ago. So what you're looking at is, if you are courageous enough to seek therapy and you're being helped and you're starting to heal and you're getting awareness from CPTSD, it's a very difficult journey because you're one of the few. There's not a lot of good therapists in this field, number one, for some of the reasons I already told you. So that's number one. So as you go through this, you're starting to go from a situation where you were living on autopilot, very unconscious, and then you start moving towards this conscious or being aware of things. Now, as you're doing that, and one of the select few, should we forgive whole generations of people that didn't have access to the information that we have now, even though the information that we have now is relatively small? Let me throw this in as a quick aside. I see this on YouTube channels all the time. There's people that are not certified, not licensed, not educated, but they can speak really well and they're really good at social media. And they have these massive YouTube channels that they talk about complex post-traumatic stress. And they're selling programs on there for $2,000. I listened to one of them the other day and I thought, wow, if I could reach through my computer right now and just turn this off, because it was so destructive and it was so misinformed. But nobody's going to know that because they have like so many followers. And this is how we start to look at people's credentials today. We don't look to see if they're licensed or certified. No, we look to see how many subscribers they have a lot of times. And I think it's extremely, extremely destructive. Let's continue. Let's look at some of the causes of CPTSD. I've done this a little bit on other shows, but let's retrack through this. So again, so we can get to the main question that I want to have answered today. Should CPTSD awareness and healing, should it include forgiving your parents? So here are some causes. Being fully dependent and living in a stressful, chaotic, unpredictable, invalidating environment with many consistent breaches in emotional attachment and connection. That's the base of it. So there's a lot of relationship stress, or we can call it interpersonal trauma. Now, this can happen with our caregivers, or it could happen with our environment. The environment, let's say you're living in poverty, for example, or you're a minority and you're treated poorly. So this relationship stress can happen within the family and also within your society. Now, this stress is prolonged, it's chronic, and it's repetitive. Typically, the needs of the caregiver comes first, and the child unconsciously blocks their unmet needs. Why? Because they're fully dependent upon their caregivers. So they make themselves small in their environment, a lot of times so they don't get punished. Now, as horrible as that sounds, some of the things that I said really should be even more disturbing to you. What is more disturbing? Well, the trauma that's experienced does not have to be blatant, obvious, and overt. This could be very well hidden trauma that parents and children, by the way, don't even understand what's happening. I never mentioned physical abuse and actual physical violence. I didn't mention sexual abuse. Again, those are very obvious, but some of them are not so obvious. That's why I think there's a lot of middle ground when we talk about should we or should we not forgive parents who may or may not have any consciousness of what they were doing. In addition, parents, they do not have to be ill-intentioned. They do not have to be mean. They do not have to be nasty. They do not have to be malicious to their children. They just have to be maybe anxious, not present, not fully aware of what they're doing. They didn't get the manual on how to be a good parent. I look back on this real quick. My parents met, my father was 15 and my mother was 12. They got married as soon as they could, which I would imagine that means my mom was 18. So a lot of the stress that I remember as a kid, my parents were barely 20 years old. They were kids. They had no idea about how to raise kids. And it gets worse because they were raised by people who didn't know how to raise kids either. But we'll get to that in a second. So here are some of the symptoms that you may have if you have lived in a situation that would cause complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, it's very confusing because a lot of these things that come up, you may not understand it as being a trauma. So let's go through a few. Having emotional flashbacks, feeling shame and guilt, self-abandonment, having a very harsh inner critic, social anxiety. Just real quick, there's so many things I'm going to mention today. I don't want to delve too deep. I'm going to do that on other shows. But just to throw in, for example, I've had social anxiety my whole life. I have it now. Like doing this show, I literally have it now. I can feel my heart rate going, oh, am I doing this? Am I doing it well enough? You know, I feel it. But I was never able to trace it to an unmet need of my childhood until maybe I was like 40 years old. That's what I'm saying. So a lot of these things go unconscious. Like you don't know until you really start studying. And again, who are the great therapists to help you through this? There's not that many of them. There's not that many great books out there as well. And then of course there's a lot of charlatans out there on YouTube selling you a bunch of garbage that they have no background whatsoever. They just want to go for the cash grab. Let me give you another one that's a real interesting symptom, and it would be limerence. Limerence is often confused with love, and I see this a lot. The difference is that limerence is when someone has an over-infatuation or over-obsession with somebody, like, oh my God, you're here, you saved me. And I see this a lot when I work with very young kids. All it takes is for like one of the other young kids to say hello to them or listen to them, and they're like, oh, I'm in love. I'm in love. This is good. We're going to get married when we can. We're going to have a bunch of kids. We're going to have a white picket fence. And unfortunately, limerence is extremely correlated to being emotionally deprived throughout your childhood. So you latch on. And when you're listened to and when you're accepted truly for who you are, it feels so good. It feels like love, even though somebody is just asking you how you are and they're sitting back and they really do want to know how you are. It doesn't mean that this is the love of your life. So again, limerence is definitely a part of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which again goes under the radar. There are people who have been born and died at 100 years old and never understood that limerence is a part of post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's continue. When a child doesn't get their needs met, they go through a lot of interesting maneuvers, most of them unconscious, in order to get their needs met or to get through the day. We're not going to detail all these out, but I'm going to give you about 10 of them right now, just so you can hear them, because I'm trying to explain how difficult it is to understand CPTSD and why we might want to give our parents a little bit of a break. Because if we don't understand it, and most therapists don't understand it, and it's not in the DSM, and the experts in the field have only been writing decent books on it in the last 10 years, we might want to give a little break to our parents who absolutely have no chance of knowing what complex post-traumatic stress disorder is. So let's go through some of these survival skills. Notice my choice of words. Survival skills. I didn't say coping skills, because these, and sometimes you needed to actually survive to get through the day. Number one, being overly conscientious. Again, trying to do the right thing at the right time, always. Number two, being overly agreeable. Again, disagreeing with your parents in some way can bring some really negative consequences, especially when your thoughts, emotions, and feelings don't matter. It doesn't mean that you'll always take a beating physically, but what I'm saying is parents who are stressed out don't tend to say, oh, can you please tell me how you feel? You know, they're not going to sit there that long and discuss their emotions and feelings with kids and allow them to speak. They're on to the next thing. They want to hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. We got food, we got laundry, we got things, we got chores, we got things. I got to go to work. These things, and maybe not to be mean, maybe not to be malicious, but they're not attending to the emotions of their child. Now, to be fair, conscientiousness and agreeableness, they're part of the big five personalities. So in other words, it could be part of your personality. That's true. However, if you are overly agreeable and overly conscientious, it's possible that your environment pushes you to be more of both. You may have been born that way anyway, but your environment will bring it out in you to where you become super traded for agreeableness and super traded for conscientiousness. Moving on, number three, being passive aggressive. Number four, being a people pleaser. Again, when the needs of the caregiver have to come first. And again, this is not said overtly, right? It's not saying the parent says, I matter and you don't. I'm a narcissist. You work for me. It doesn't necessarily happen like that. But what happens is that the parent does have to do their job. They do have to go to work. They do have to get things done. And the kids are obviously their children. They're going to be subordinate. It's like, you need to go to bed at this time. You need to do this. You need to do that. And there's a lot of emotions and feelings don't come into play with a lot of people. Doesn't matter. You just have to kind of just get the kids to do what they need to do. That's the way a lot of parenting is. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not saying it's correct. I'm just saying that it happens. Number five, being neurotically naive. I see this a lot with people that I do therapy with. They're like, well, my childhood wasn't that bad. It was actually pretty good when you compare it to other people. Right? So they disregard their emotions and feelings, perceptions and experiences, because they're always trying to find someone else who is worse. And the reason why that happens is because that's what you need when you're a kid, right? You can't just say, oh, my life sucks, it's the worst. What you do is you say, well, it's not as bad as so-and-so. Well, at least I ate today. Or at least this happened. At least I didn't get punched in the face today. At least I didn't get yelled at this week as much as I did last week. So they're always looking for the silver lining, but they're never actually really responding to their own emotions and feelings. And this becomes a good survival skill when they're dependent upon their parents. It becomes a situation where they're going to run themselves right into abuse when they're in romantic relationships when they get older. Moving on, perfectionism. It's a great coping skill or a survival skill in order to avoid being criticized or being punished or being made fun of, right? So a person would say, well, I'm more lovable to myself and more lovable to other people when I'm perfect and I win all the time. So how can I take any of the negative responses? My parents seem to be very annoyed, angry, frustrated, critical. Well, if I'm getting straight A's and I'm doing well in sports and I have all these friends, I guess none of that negativity can come towards me, or at least I minimize that. So that's why, again, perfectionism that is rewarded extremely well in society, somebody may not see that it's a symptom of complex post-traumatic stress. They see it as a great thing. Let's say you own a business. Don't you want to hire a perfectionist? Most people would, right? They'll work hard, they'll get the job done, they'll do anything you ask. That's perfect. Society loves you. But what's the cost for the individual doing it? They're doing it because they don't feel good enough. And that's who I care about, because that's the person who comes to me. But again, if they're in a situation where they felt that they needed to be perfect all the time, should we forgive parents? Well, again, I'm going to put that on you. I'm going to give you more information and you could come up with the answer for yourself. Emotophobia is another symptom. It's the fear of hurting other people's feelings. Again, you're in a situation at home, you don't want to hurt your parents' feelings. You say, well, hey, I want a new pair of sneakers. All my friends have sneakers. And all of a sudden, your parent knows that they can't afford it. So they feel guilt, they feel shame, they feel angry at themselves. So what do? They take it out on the kid and say, oh, you want too many things. Who are you? You're a entitled brat. You're not allowed to want things. So the child makes themselves smaller. They don't understand that it's a parenting problem. They think it's a them problem. And even if they did understand that it's their parents' problem, the way they deal with it is to disintegrate their needs. And they get very, very in tune with trying to make sure that other people don't get angry with them. So they fear other people's negative feelings. They also fear their own feelings. They're not allowed to have feelings, so they don't become very good at being able to express them or even being able to know that they actually have any. We'll probably talk about that a little bit later in the show. Continuing, a person who has symptoms of CPTSD, they may, in social situations, attune themselves to the most broken person there. Again, they're used to dealing with broken people, people that are stressed out, people that have problems, people that are not doing very well in life. And so they attune to that. Again, they repeat to repair. It's familiar to them. Typically, they're not going to attach themselves to the person who's very standoffish, that doesn't need anything from anybody. Even little things in life sound like an affront or can hurt a person's feelings who has CPTSD. Let's say you're on the phone with somebody and you say to somebody, oh, I really have to run, I'm busy. And the other person says, good, bye, and they hang up. Well, that's normal. That's what should happen. But a person with CPTSD, they want the other person to hang on a little bit. In other words, I gotta go, I'm busy. They say, no, I still wanna talk to you. Hold on a second. Because typically a person with CPTSD, they're so involved with not trying to hurt other people's feelings that they don't wanna tell people when they have to go. So when they have to do it and somebody else says, okay, I'm gone, it puts them in a position where they're incredibly uncomfortable. Moving on. People who have CPTSD almost have no concept of validation. And I grew up with this. I remember being in a therapy office about, in the early 90s. And this therapist wanted me to read a book. And a lot of it had to do with validation. And I went into the therapy session And she said, how did you like the book? And I said, it's constantly on this word called validation. I still don't know what it means. And after working on it, it occurred to me, like, why would a person need to be validated, to feel good enough, to want to be seen, to want to be heard, so they can continue maybe doing some of the things that they enjoyed? And I realized I never had that. Like, if I wanted to play football, if I wanted to work out, if I wanted to go to school, I never was validated about any of that. I just did it. So I had no concept, which is okay, because that's a good coping skill or a survival skill in itself. Except that when you're in relationships, everybody else in the world that's quote unquote normal, they do want to be validated. They do want to be seen. They do want to be heard. They do want to be complimented. I had no concept that that was a truth. Like, I was like, well, okay, but why do I need to tell you you're doing good at what you like to do and what you're good at? Don't you do it for you? Like, I never understood that. It took me a long time to be able to understand what the word validation was. I had no concept. Again, if you're not getting that and you're not taught it, you can't be that. I wasn't trying to be malicious or hurtful to anybody. I just had no concept of what validation was, unfortunately. All right, so now we have a lot of information here. So if you go through the tremendous difficulties of learning about CPTSD, again, something that many therapists don't know, and something probably your parents had no chance of knowing, and knowing that your parents had no ill will or maliciousness towards you. Now, some of you out there, they probably did, okay? So that's a different story. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about basic mistakes that human beings make. So if we know this, what's the best path forward? A, we can consider forgiveness. Number two, we can be angry. We can blame parents. We can ruminate about our tough childhoods. We can vilify our parents. Why? Because we learned something about CPTSD. So then we move into a section that I would call toxic spirituality. Because there's a lot of people who learn just enough from their therapist or just enough off of a YouTube channel to start the hate and the blame on their parents. And the toxic part of the spirituality becomes the word enlightened for them means that they're enlightened because they learned something yesterday that you don't know right now. So they're one day ahead of you, but they're enlightened. Or they look at an ignorant person, their term ignorant, and say, well, you're ignorant because you don't know this. But I learned it 5 minutes ago. So that means I'm on the pedestal and I can look down on you. Right? Like, so I think that there's a lot of people that are misinformed about what it is that healing is, and awareness is, and being empowered and being enlightened is. Because I don't think it's to learn one concept that somebody doesn't know, and you just learned it 2 minutes ago, and all of a sudden you think you're better, so there's no forgiveness that's going to go on here. I hope you understand what I'm saying. So if you are considering whether you want to forgive your parents or not, and make that part of your journey to go through CPTSD, here's just some thoughts. I'm not telling you what to do. At some point, you might want to consider forgiving your parents for not being perfect. You might want to consider forgiving your parents for expecting you in your birth to make them happy. I think a lot of parents do that, right? They put a child into this world and they're like, I'm going to be so happy, it's going to hold our relationship together. This is going to be the best thing ever. And it is. Most parents that I know say their child is the best thing that they've ever done in their life. It's their biggest accomplishment. However, they may not have been so expert at raising a child. You might want to consider forgiving your parents for doing their best to raise you while still being a victim and a product of their own unresolved trauma. You might want to consider forgiving your parents for not being able to teach you the skills that they never had because nobody taught them. You might want to consider forgiving your parents for not being emotionally available to you because the professionals taught them to let babies cry themselves to sleep and to give toddlers timeouts, and that children are to be seen and not heard. All of which we know that are very destructive to children today and do cause CPTSD. But this was instructed by professionals for many years. So if you follow the professionals, you are causing CPTSD unknowingly. You might want to consider forgiving your parents for being anxious and not always being present with you while worrying how they were going to keep you fed and with a roof over your head. And you might want to consider forgiving your parents for overprotecting you because seeing you hurt or scared was too much for them to bear. And you might want to consider forgiving your parents for getting a divorce because although it's better to come from a broken home than to live in a broken home, it still causes damage. One more thing, as you're trying to figure out for yourself if you should forgive your parents or not. Depending on your age, one day, your kids might be old enough to start blaming you for all the things that you did to them that you didn't mean to do to hurt them. And ask yourself, would you like to be forgiven for those things? And if you have no knowledge of CPTSD and somebody comes to you with all of this knowledge about what CPTSD is now, that in all of humankind, we've only really been talking about it for 10 years, what are the chances you think a parent is going to deny or defend themselves or justify themselves? Like 100%? Is it because they hate you? Or is it because they hate themselves? And because they don't understand some of this new information that's out there? And if your parents don't understand the new information that's out there, guess what? They're not alone. Most therapists don't understand it either. You want to test me on it? Try to find a great therapist that deals with complex post-traumatic stress disorder and get back to me and see how that works for you. It's still not talked about in graduate programs still. So if a therapist really cares about this, it has to be someone who's gone through it and lived through it. And then they did as much reading as they possibly could. It's not part of, again, mainstream psychology. Not yet. It should be, though. And by the way, I left out Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. I should mention him. I do not have his book here, but I would feel bad if I didn't mention him because he's an absolute rock star in this field. And I did go to his seminar a couple of months ago, but I don't have his book right in front of me, so I want to mention that because I don't want to leave him out. Anyway, I hope you found today's show valuable. My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. Please subscribe and tell a friend. Thank you.